Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Courtney Tacker and I'm the Director of Local Initiatives with the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. Thank you all for joining us today. We are excited to see such a great turnout for this Housing First webinar. Today's presentation is intended to provide an overview of California's Housing First requirements as defined by the state, as well as a high-level overview of some best practices when following a Housing First approach. We know there are many people here today that bring a range of experiences with Housing First, from those who have been using a Housing First model for many years to those who may be learning about it for one of the first times. Therefore, our goal today is to use this hour to provide everyone with a baseline understanding of Housing First, and then use this opportunity to understand what additional resources we can provide that would be helpful in your understanding and implementation of Housing First. At the end of this presentation, participants will have the chance to post ideas for additional resources in the chat so we can help facilitate future conversations specific to your needs. All of that to say, today is just the beginning of a conversation and we greatly appreciate your input. I want to sincerely thank you again for being with us today and for all of the work that you do every day to end homelessness. I will now turn it over to Brina Silv to get us started this morning.
Thank you, Courtney. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Brina Silv. I'm the Local Initiatives Coordinator with the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. Before we begin, we have a couple brief housekeeping items. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website following the presentation. Also note that attendees' cameras and mics will be off throughout the presentation, so please use the chat function for any questions or comments. Our staff will be monitoring the chat to try and answer as many questions as possible. However, since there are so many of you here, we may not have the chance to get all of them during our time today, but we'll work to follow up with everyone afterward. But just because we can't see you doesn't mean we don't want to get to know you. So I have some poll questions to see who's in the audience today. Our first poll question is, where are you from? So, hold up. There we go. Have several options here, should be up on your screen. Great, looks like we got people from all over. Give you a couple seconds to answer that. Okay, and I'll end the poll. All right, looks like we have everyone, a lot of people from across the state. That's so great. Okay, and then next poll I have is, what type of organization do you represent? So next we'll be presenting, we'll have introductions from our presenters and I'll allow them to introduce themselves, starting with Giselle Sanchez.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, it says I'm on mute, which I'm not, so this is very confusing. So thank you, welcome for joining, thank you for joining us. I'm Giselle Sanchez, I'm the council specialist.
And then we have Judith Hen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Judith Hen. I am the California Statewide Policy Specialist for CalICH. Nice to meet everyone.
And last but not least, we have Nena Garcia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nena Garcia, and I'm the local homeless specialist here at CalICH.
Great, thank you. And here's our agenda for today. We will be learning first, what is Housing First with Giselle, followed by what equity in Housing First looks like with Judith, then exploring Housing First in practice with Nena, followed by a chance to share with us what resource you would like to see about Housing First in the future to help you all in your work administering and implementing homelessness services. Now I will hand it over to Giselle.
Thank you, Brina. Hello. So in this section, I'll be giving an overview of Housing First. For some of you, this might be new information, while for others, you may have more experience with it. No matter your familiarity, we wanted to provide some foundational context to get us all on the same page about the state's Housing First requirements. In this section, I'll talk about California's Housing First definition, a summary of its core components, and our role as Cal ICH in the implementation of the state's commitment to Housing First. All right, next slide. Great. So let me start by saying that Housing First is not one type of program, but rather an approach, and it could be applied to any type of program within the homelessness response system, more commonly in emergency shelters, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. Those are all types that operate using some sort of Housing First principles and practices, but it could also be applied to outreach programs, diversion and problem-solving programs, drop-in centers, and many other programs. California is a Housing First state, which means that it has adopted statutory and regulatory language requiring programs receiving certain funding to utilize a Housing First approach. This is the definition written in statute. Housing First means the evidence-based model that uses housing as a tool rather than a reward for recovery, and that centers on providing or connecting people experiencing homelessness to permanent housing as quickly as possible. Housing First providers offer services as needed and as requested on a voluntary basis, and does not make housing contingent on participation in services. So essentially, Housing First means that people who are experiencing homelessness need housing, and the interventions offered to them should all be oriented around helping people secure housing. A project does not need to provide housing or deliver housing-based services to adopt Housing First principles. A related concept is housing focused, which means a program, whatever type it is, includes helping people identify a pathway to housing as one of the central goals of that program model and of the services delivered. Providing Housing First does not mean that people don't also need services, but services are offered on a voluntary basis if people want them, and not a requirement people must meet as a precondition to securing housing. The ultimate goal of this is to get people permanently housed and to end their homelessness. Next slide, please. Thank you. The approach of Housing First works off the belief that basic necessities, such as a place to live, are needed before providing other services that may help people improve their stability. Housing First facilitates faster access to housing, which then leads to a higher likelihood of remaining housed. It also emphasizes client choice, allowing people to opt into services that will help them stabilize and be more successful in maintaining their housing. Permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing are two common models that follow Housing First approaches because they offer people experiencing homelessness rapid access to housing with voluntary services. There is plenty of research that shows that these program models are effective. For example, studies have shown that permanent supportive housing projects have had up to a 98% rate of long-term housing retention. Similarly, rapid rehousing projects have allowed people to exit homelessness faster and are more likely to remain housed. Cases show between 75% and 91% of households remain housed a year after being rapidly rehoused. These program models can also be more cost-effective in the long run. As more people successfully maintain housing, there are fewer returns to homelessness and then less use of emergency services. So those include shelters, jails, and hospitals within the community. Another study found that an average cost saving of emergency services was over $30,000 per person over the course of 2 years. So all these data points I mentioned came from the National Alliance to End Homelessness's fact sheet on rapid rehousing, which will be included in the resources we send out after today's presentation. Okay, move on to the next slide. I encourage you to look at resources from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. This is actually an interactive photo on their website. It links you to various studies that are, if you're looking for more examples of Housing First and its successes, if you hover over each one of those bubbles, they look like rocks or stones. It'll tell you a title of a study and take you to where you could find that study. There's a lot of evidence in support of Housing First as a successful strategy and virtually no evidence to suggest otherwise. So if you want to visit this page, the link to this webpage would be found in the photo credit here. Thank you. So now I'll move on to some of California's statutory language. A couple of key statutes that established the implementation of Housing First in the state include SB 1380. This legislation had the state adopt the Housing First model. It actually created the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council, which is now Cal ICH, and it created it to oversee the implementation of Housing First in the state. It also introduced the core components of Housing First, which I will get into in the next slide. Last year, there was a couple of additions made. AB 977 calls for programs funding recovering housing to adopt Housing First components this summer by July 1st, 2022. And AB 1220 expanded the implementation of these components to include state programs funding emergency shelters. The state of California has adopted statutory and regulatory language requiring programs receiving certain funding sources to implement specific core components for a Housing First approach. Most of the state's language is specific to housing providers, but other providers serving people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness should also adopt housing-focused approaches when they are able to. There are 11 core components that generally fall under one of these core categories. The first is tenant screening, or that housing providers are accepting referrals from their local homelessness response system, and that those tenants are not being rejected due to a lack of sobriety or housing readiness. The other one is housing-based services, or that service providers are using evidence-based practices to engage with clients. So practices such as a harm reduction philosophy. We also have that services are voluntary. Services are tenant driven and that there are no preconditions to accepting services in order to receive housing. And lastly, housing permanency, that tenants are provided with the lease and that they have the rights and responsibilities of tenancy. So for reference, here are the 11 core components. I know this is a lot of text and I will not be reading these out loud, but you're welcome to take a screenshot and read them later. If you're gonna go back and watch the recorded webinar, when this becomes available, you're welcome to pause and take a second to read that. These could also be found in the Welfare and Institutions Code, or WIC, section 8255B. Again, most of these apply to housing providers. So components such as tenant screening or providing leases would not be applicable to all providers, but all providers can implement housing-focused and low barrier approaches. All right. And lastly, Cal ICH has a significant role in getting everyone on the same page about Housing First. As mentioned before, Cal ICH oversees the implementation of Housing First in state programs and funding. So as part of this, we are working with our state partners to ensure that there is inclusion of the Housing First core components in relevant programs. The expectation is that California state departments who administer or fund projects serving people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness have implemented these core components into their guidelines and regulations, or that they work with us to address those barriers in the implementation. It is also our expectation that those departments are working with their grantees to help ensure the Housing First implementation. To provide an overview of this process, last year we identified there are over 30 state programs across 10 state entities serving people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. In January, we sent out a survey to our state partners to collect information on their inclusion of Housing First core components in their programs in order to understand where we are successful at this implementation and where we are facing barriers or where we need to focus additional resources. So with the survey, we're hoping to strengthen the implementation of Housing First across the state so that we are effective in preventing and ending homelessness in California. All right, thank you. That is it for me. I am going to pass it off to Judith to go through some of the equity in Housing First.
Thank you, Giselle. Hello, everyone. My name is Judith Tin, and once again, I'm the statewide policy specialist for Cal ICH. In this section, we want to briefly discuss some data around equity and homelessness and how Housing First can be a tool for creating more equitable services. A person's social identity relates to such traits as race or ethnicity, religion, gender, gender identity, or sexual orientation, ability, and other factors that influence an individual's background and experience. Cal ICH's Homeless Data Integration System, aka HDIS, measures the number of people accessing homelessness services in California over a span of a year. Using data from calendar year 2019, we can identify particular disparities that we want to be aware of in order to provide culturally specific services to the provision of programs and housing for people experiencing homelessness. In particular, using HDIS, we can see there are significant racial disparities in the population of people experiencing homelessness in our state. Next slide, please. Racial inequities and homelessness are inseparable. The racial makeup of people experiencing homelessness does not mirror the racial makeup of generation population in the state. California is committed to tackling racial disparities in homelessness through the implementation of Cal ICH's Action Plan for Preventing and Ending Homelessness in California. One of the main areas of focus of the action plan is racial equity. The plan can be found on our website. HDIS can also be a useful tool for understanding what racial disparities exist in California amongst people experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. Statistics on racial equity. As you can see here, people identifying as Black or African American make up only 5.6% of the state's population, but according to HDIS, they represent about 30% of people accessing homelessness services in our state. While people identifying as American Indian or Alaska Native make up only 0.8% of the state overall, they represent 2.7% of those accessing homelessness services. Similarly, people identifying as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander make up about 0.4% of the state, but 1.2% of those are accessing these services. These disparities are the result of historic racism in housing and social safety net policies. And our commitment to Housing First as a state is meant to ensure everyone has access to safe, affordable housing with services that meet their specific needs. Next slide, please. Other characteristics of people accessing homelessness services are shown in data from HDIS, revealing that while the majority of people accessing these services are between the ages of 25 and 54. There are a significant number of youths under 24, and as well as people above the age of 55. Of the people experiencing homelessness in the state, 9% identifying as veterans, 43% report disabling conditions, and 18% report having experienced domestic violence. It is important to understand data about the people we serve so we can appropriately tailor our housing and services to the needs of people wherever they're at in their lives. Next slide, please. In the next section, we will discuss best practices in providing services in accordance with a housing first approach. As we've seen from the data, it is crucial to understand what groups of people are experiencing homelessness so we can provide tailored, person-centered services to them and effectively help them locate housing and stay housed. To do this work, we can further develop and demonstrate cultural sensitivity by identifying and understanding our own biases to a certain group, including those biases that we are not aware of. We can continue to work together with colleagues to openly discuss biases, raise awareness about them, and work on strategies to remove them when we are providing services. Additionally, working with a variety of community partners and hiring staff that are reflective of the population of people experiencing homelessness can help eliminate these blind spots and create services that are culturally responsive. We must continue to use empathy and compassion to understand all people experiencing homelessness, learn about their experiences, and be open to their feedback about our services. I want to echo my appreciation to all of you in attendance today for your hard work in the journey to end homelessness in California. Next, I will turn it over to my colleague, Nana, who will go over some best practices for putting housing first concepts to use.
Thank you, Judith, and hello, everyone. In this section, we'll review effective practices that relate to housing first core components listed in the earlier slides. These include techniques to engage clients and center client choice and rights when providing services to persons experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. I'll begin with a brief review of housing first basics. A cornerstone of housing first, as mentioned previously, is connection to permanent housing as quickly as possible, requiring no additional steps or participation in services before obtaining housing or in order to retain housing. Providing low barrier services includes removing as many restrictions and preconditions to participation as possible. A part of providing low barrier services is making sure to incorporate a trauma-informed care approach. Next slide, please. Trauma-informed care is an evidence-based approach to service delivery that staff and volunteers should utilize when engaging with clients. Trauma-informed care recognizes that services and supports must be designed to respond to the prevalent trauma among people who've experienced homelessness and the ongoing trauma that people experiencing or at risk of homelessness face daily. It focuses on how to address existing trauma and prevent re-traumatization. SAMHSA describes individual trauma as resulting from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. It has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Trauma awareness and trauma-informed care is a critical component of engagement with clients. It is acknowledging that the role of trauma the individual being served has experienced and incorporates an understanding of trauma into the role of service provider. This includes approaching every conversation with an understanding of the vulnerability a client is experiencing, realizing that trauma can affect the way a client responds to services. Trauma can be accompanied by symptoms of shock, anger, anxiety, sadness, and other emotions that can be exhibited outwardly or displayed through withdrawing. Understanding trauma and symptoms of trauma can promote recovery and avoid experiences of re-traumatization. It's important for program policies to balance the objective of helping participants secure housing with a recognition that each person will be starting from a different place in terms of their readiness to engage with housing services. For example, you might establish a policy that each participant should develop a housing plan, but you would also provide flexible timelines for developing and implementing that plan, ensuring the plan reflects steps that participants is ready to take and services the participant is ready to accept. Next slide, please. Fully engaging clients into their own plans includes employing the following principles into trauma-informed approach. The CDC and SAMHSA created an infographic that lists 6 guiding principles. Safety. Emphasis on safety, both physical and emotional, during interactions with clients help facilitate more effective. Trustworthiness and transparency. Programs should operate with transparency throughout all aspects of service delivery, with a focus on building and maintaining trust. Peer support. Peers serve an integral role in assisting others to achieving housing stability and other personal goals. Collaboration and mutuality. Value is placed on partnership and a shared approach to decision-making. Empowerment, voice, and choice. People's strengths and experiences are honored, and emphasis is placed on client choice to determine housing and service needs. Cultural, historical, and gender issues. Inequities, biases, and the impacts of historical trauma should be actively identified and addressed within the homelessness response system. In summary, using a trauma-informed care approach can create a safer environment that promotes trust and transparency, collaboration, and empowerment when working with clients. It requires consistent engagement with peer support, sensitivity to historical background, as well as cultural and gender awareness. These guidelines require intentional efforts that ultimately increases recovery. In addition, a trauma-informed approach includes engagement with fellow providers, staff, and volunteers. Secondhand trauma can be an unfortunate outcome of this type of work, and communication and safety measures, trainings and check-ins with coworkers and supervisors are important for the well-being of staff at all levels. Next slide, please. In addition to a trauma-informed approach, there are further strategies to service delivery, including a person-centered approach. A person-centered approach emphasizes client choice through collaborative decision-making of potential housing interventions, goals, and services provided. A person-centered approach tailors each client's services to their unique strengths, needs, and preferences, and emphasizes regular and ongoing engagement with clients throughout the service delivery process. Organizations can incorporate staff trainings and technical assistance to effectively implement a person-centered delivery of services, which includes a trauma-informed approach, as discussed previously, a harm reduction approach that recognizes substance use as a part of a client's lives, while emphasizing non-judgmental communication and education on safer practices. Motivation interviewing, an evidence-based practice that uses key skills for structured engagement to build trust and respect. And strength-based approaches, which acknowledges that each person is an expert of their own experiences in life. These experiences can be assets, strengths, and competence that can be built upon when making decisions and working towards outcomes. Next slide, please. A major tenet of building strength is having the critical support of shelter and housing. Shelter plays an important role within the homelessness response system, and they can use a shelter or a housing first approach to serve clients by structuring shelter eligibility, policies, and practices to be accessible for anyone experiencing homelessness. A shelter program model can be designed to focus on helping participants secure housing or the next step towards housing. providing appropriate problem solving or diversion services so that people seeking to access shelter are assisted to secure and immediate housing solutions if possible. Some examples are restoring a tenancy through mediation with the landlord, moving in with a friend or family member, or coordinating a shared housing option. Again, housing first means providing immediate and low barrier access to shelter with no preconditions, such as sobriety or income requirements. Program rules are clear and limited to focus on safety. People are not discharged back into homelessness unnecessarily. Services in shelter that assist in a quick exit to permanent housing options can include housing-focused case management, housing navigation, connections to coordinated entry, shelter staff trained and knowledgeable about housing solutions, and participants having the opportunity to develop a housing plan, and regularly evaluating data to determine effectiveness of shelter outcomes, including exits to housing, length of stay in shelter, and returns to homelessness. Next slide, please. The effectiveness of housing is strengthened when tenants understand their rights. As Giselle touched on earlier, Housing First core components emphasizes a tenant's rights to having a lease and all the rights and responsibilities of tenancy. This can include communicating tenant rights to clients along with tenant responsibilities and property rules, removing barriers that may impact clients by simplifying and streamlining materials such as applications for services, or helping navigate required documents needed for tenancy. As tenants better understand their rights and responsibilities, they have the opportunity for greater housing stability. Next slide, please. Greater housing stability demands intentional strategic support. Housing First is not housing only. Strategic support and services are shown to have a stabilizing and positive impact on an individual or families experiencing homelessness. Services are intended to support a client's opportunity to obtain and maintain housing and should always remain voluntary. Providers can support tenants' rights by partnering with both tenants and landlords through a proactive housing retention approach. Providers can also facilitate coordination to other mainstream services, which can include basic needs through foods programs and eligible health services and benefits. Clients may also need support acquiring identification, while others may need childcare or transportation. Service coordination can also include discharge planning for clients being released from institutional care. Case managers often help coordinate many of these services while also co-developing a support plan with clients. Clients will require different lengths of service connections, short-term to permanent, depending on the client's needs. Services should remain accessible to clients despite a change in housing status. Housing First and supportive services means they are made available, but participation is not required to access housing. Tailored support through housing interventions and services can increase housing retention outcomes. And these tailored supportive services involve working in coordination with the client to help them better identify their own needs, including explaining client choices, expectations, and processes for engagement. Next slide, please. We've come to the end of this section. Before I go, here are several links to resources that may be valuable. They include additional information on the topics we've covered today and will be available in the presentation materials that will be posted to our website shortly. And with that, I will hand it back to Brina.
Thank you so much, Nana. And thank you to all of you again for joining this introductory presentation on Housing First. We know we only touched briefly on a lot of very important topics, so we want to make sure to hear from you about what you'd like to explore in the future. So we'll take the rest of our time to hear from you about what additional resources would be helpful for you in implementing Housing First going forward. These can be related to topics that we touched on today or others that were not covered. So on the screen here, you will see we have some questions that we hope you'll respond to in the chat. So our first question is, what other Housing First related resources would help you in your work? So please put your answers to that first question into the chat. I'll give everyone a couple minutes to do that. I like that idea. Motivational interviewing role play. Okay, I see additional funding. I'm assuming how to access additional funding. Okay. Okay, additional information on how Housing First can work when a client prefers a sober living environment. Okay, I like these ideas. Housing rights for tenants, great. Okay. Great, thank you so much to everyone for answering that first question. Another question we want to get your input on is, what barriers do you face in implementing Housing First in your work? So please put your answers into the chat. Let us know your thoughts. Not enough landlords. Lack of available affordable units, right? Housing costs and availability, right? Housing inventory, right. Great, these are all really great suggestions. Thank you so much for being open and honest about the barriers you face. And we were also wondering, what specific topics would you want more information on? How to use HMIS data. Yeah, that's important. Income requirements for landlords, property management, and housing authorities. Okay. Landlord engagement. Yes. How to better support persons with criminal history. Very important. I like that suggestion. Trauma-informed care crisis intervention training. Great. Understanding racial equity. How to support undocumented clients. Very important. I like that as well. Okay. Great. Thank you all so much for sharing that. And lastly, what format for these resources would be most useful for you? Another webinar, a fact sheet? What mode of communication would be most beneficial for you? I see webinars and fact sheets, symposium, webinars, all of the above. That is also an option. Infographics. Community sharing discussions. I like that. Templates, webinars, interactive webinar. Okay. Lean in circles. Great. Also, I figured out my glitch from earlier. So I still want to know who we have in our audience today. So I'm going to try and relaunch this poll. What type of organization do you represent? I really want to know. Great. Looks like we have a lot of service providers, local government partners. We have some people in state government. Give you a couple more seconds to answer that. And while I have that pull up, I would still love to hear more suggestions or input you have to any of these questions that we have up here on the screen. Okay, so I'll go ahead and end that poll. All right, looks like we have service providers. We have a good mix of folks today: service providers, local government partners, and state government. That's great. Okay, and then another poll I have for you was before this presentation today, what was your familiarity with Housing First and its principles? So let me put that up. We have very familiar, familiar, somewhat familiar, barely familiar, or not familiar. Be honest. Good, we have some suggestions coming in. Great. Okay, I'll go ahead and end that poll. Looks like we have a lot of people with different backgrounds or familiarity with Housing First. Very good mix of people. So I hope this presentation today was able to expound or give you some more knowledge about Housing First. Great. And I'll go back to the chat here, look at some other suggestions. Some goal templates, because your agency is starting from scratch. That's very important. Okay. Technical assistance consultation with CalACH for state agencies integrating the Housing First requirements into housing and homelessness grant programs. Okay. Great. Capacity and funding are barriers, right? Best practices and frequently asked questions. Okay, great. Thank you all so much for taking the time to answer those questions. And I just want to thank everyone again. Your participation will help us provide the most useful information possible in our future work. So I have one last slide here, which is just a simple thank you for joining us today. But last but not least, we still want to learn from you what you thought about the presentation today. So I have one last poll, simply asking, was this webinar helpful? So you should see that question there up on the screen. Give you a minute or two to answer that one. This is also a great opportunity if you have that one last additional feedback you would like to provide. You can put that into the chat. What would you like to see in the future? And also, if you have any follow-up questions, here's our email. And to keep up with what CalACH is doing here are our social media links. Okay, and I'll go ahead and end that poll. Great. Looks like a lot of you thought this webinar was helpful. Thank you so much for that input. Great, and once again, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.